Hello, my name is Jonathan E. Russell, and this is my expository presentation on the subject of women in the church according to the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul wrote about the role of women in the church several times in his epistles. For most of church history, these passages have been interpreted the same way, which is, in short, that women should not be ordained into ministry, nor should they hold spiritual authority over any men in the church or their families. However, in recent years, in light of the progress of feminism, these interpretations have been called into questions and hotly debated amongst Christians. As a generalization, there are two main views on the issue that have emerged: complementarianism and egalitarianism. Complementarianism is the traditional view of the role of women in the church and the family. Complementarians say that just as Eve was created as a helper for Adam, so also men and women are to have equal yet distinct complementary roles. In the context of a marriage, the role of a woman is to submit herself to her husband and to be his helper. Likewise, the role of a man is to cherish his wife, treat her with love and respect, and lead her with both reverence and authority and compassion as well. I chose this picture to represent the view of complementarianism because it shows how, even just by nature, we can see that men and women complement each other to a certain degree. The woman has long hair on the top of her head, and the man has short hair on the top of his head. The woman has short hair on her face, well, pretty much no hair. And the man has a little bit of hair on the bottom of his face, on the bottom of his chin. Yet both are beautiful, and both are created in the image of God. Both have an incredible smile, hence why they were used on this dentistry website. So that's why I chose that picture, is to show that men and women can complement each other very well. These distinct roles also translate to the context of the church, where both men and women serve, but in distinct capacities. In short, men are to lead the church as leaders, as elders and deacons and teachers and preachers, while women are to serve the church in more hands-on and practical capacities. In contrast, egalitarians argue that men and women are pure equals with no distinctive roles within the church. They say that men and women were both created by God as equals, and that God does not distinguish between the two when it comes to role in the church or in the family. Thus, in the context of a marriage, rather than the wife submitting to the husband, both partners mutually submit to one another. In the context of the church, women should not be disqualified from serving as elders, deacons, teachers, preachers, or any other leadership capacity. I have a picture here of women who are priests in the Roman Catholic Church. To come to this conclusion, egalitarians argue that Paul's words about women in the church were crafted and spoken for a specific time, a specific place, and a specific cultural situation that is no longer our situation today. Thus, each passage written by Paul regarding the role of women has come to have many interpretations, ranging from incredibly literal and dogmatic to incredibly loose and ignoring the message's original intent. Extreme views can develop on either side. All the way to the left of egalitarianism, we find Christian feminism, where people believe that gender is simply a social construct, so nothing is off limits for women. And on the very right, in the extreme version of complementarianism, we have patriarchalism, or chauvinism, as many would like to call it. And in the chauvinism or patriarchalism, men rule in all areas of life, and women submit to that rule. It sounds very extreme. So we're going to examine a few passages in this presentation, and an egalitarian view of the passage will be explained, as well as a complementarian view of the passage. We're going to exclusively focus on the commands that Paul makes toward women on this subject. Before and after these commands, there are also commands for men, but those commands tend to remain not very controversial and very agreeable, whereas Paul's commands about women have been controversial and have been disagreeable. And so, in this presentation, we're going to focus exclusively on those and divulge those ideas. So let's examine the scripture together. In 1 Timothy 2, verse 11 and 12, it says this: "A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet." This is, of course, in the NASB translation. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34, also in the NASB translation, says this: "As in all the churches of the saints, the women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says." If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. Before divulging the views about these passages, a few terms require explanation. Firstly, in the Bible, when someone is described as a man, it generally means an adult man who has left his father and mother to start his own household. Both groups, complementarians and egalitarians, tend to agree that male children are not intended to be included in the interpretation of these passages. Secondly, an entirely separate debate could be had simply on the phrase exercise authority, and what is specifically intended by that phrase. For the purposes of this presentation, the most common current view of the word will be cited, which is that the word authority denotes scriptural and spiritual authority. Thus, authority comprises both church leadership and teaching about Scripture, but not necessarily authority in every aspect of life. Egalitarians will be quick to say about these passages that they were intended for a specific cultural context so that the church may be more suitable for the culture it was in. Indeed, the culture of Corinth and that of the church that Timothy was ministering to were both quite chauvinistic, and it would have shocked outsiders if women in the church were much more assertive than those outside of it. In addition, the teaching style of that day was different than today, more resembling a Sunday school type environment. Thus, what is likely meant by learning quietly and not speaking in church is really meant to mean without interjecting with questions. Hence why it is said that the women should ask their husbands at home if they have a question. Complementarians would argue for a reading that follows the spirit of the context of the teaching, without adjusting or understanding based on the cultural norms of the days. Thus, based on a straightforward reading, women are to learn with submission in the church and not hold authority over men. This, of course, does not mean that women are not to utter a single word on the premises of a church building, but rather that they are to be humble recipients of teaching, since that was likely the context that Paul spoke of. A complementarian's reasoning for the view that cultural relevance is insignificant is that what follows 1 Timothy 2:12 is a reason that transcends culture, that Adam was created first, and then Eve, and that Eve was the one who was deceived and sinned. Let's examine some more passages. Colossians 3:18, again in the NASB translation, says, "Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord." Ephesians 5:22 also says, "Wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands, as to the Lord." An egalitarian would argue once again about cultural relevance, but also that prior to Ephesians 5:22, Paul says, "And subject yourselves to one another in the fear of Christ." This is where they get the idea of mutual submission rather than distinct roles in marriage. A complementarian would argue that, once again, Paul gives a reason that transcends culture in Colossians 3:18. He says, "As is fitting in the Lord." In addition, a complementarian would argue that the command for mutual submission in Ephesians refers to the church as a whole, and that Paul is beginning a distinct thought when he writes about marriage. In conclusion, both egalitarianism and complementarianism have their strengths and weaknesses as ideas. It seems that, overall, complementarianism seems to favor a literal reading of the Scripture, while egalitarianism seems to favor a cultural reading of the Scripture. I hope this presentation has helped you understand this debate on a deeper level. Thanks for watching.